And you're still promoting Sterling now. Isn't that insulting to Wichita State?
No, I even told my teacher last week that I didn't really like Wichita. So.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Well, now, does that mean you don't like the Wichita State basketball team?
No.
What?
I am a Jayhawk.
You're a Jayhawk?
I am.
You're in dangerous territory
Yeah.
down there.
I'll be alright.
They have a good coach.
Yeah, they do.
And they've done very, very well the last few years.
Yep. All right.
Okay, well, you can articulate the questions. I don't.
Okay. Just state your name and where you live and your occupation.
Okay. Well, my name is Harley Wagler, and currently I live in Russia. I live in Nizhny Novgorod, which is a city about 400 kilometers straight east of Moscow on the Volga River. I have lived there for 22 years. I teach in a university there, and for 17 years I had a program in which I brought American students from Christian colleges to study for 1 semester at the university where I teach. But in 2010, they closed that program, so now I am just working at the university. I teach literature and philosophy. In literature, I teach comparative works, both Russian and American and English works, and compare the values they share. And in philosophy, I teach basically classical philosophy from the pre-Socratics. I begin with mythology, the pre-philosophical worldview, and then I move into mythology and the pre-Socratics, classical Greek and Roman philosophy, and then basically give an overview of Western philosophy. I do not go into Indian or Oriental philosophy or Arabic philosophy. I stick with Western philosophy. So that is what I do. And every summer I need to come back to Kansas because I need to get a visa to work in Russia. So that visa is good for only 1 year. But I have a very good relationship with the university and the government, so I have no problem getting a visa. It's just a formality that I need to observe.
What got you interested in Russia in the first place?
Okay, well, there were several factors in my childhood that got me interested in Russia. When I was 8 years old, we had visitors from Ohio, John and Joe Overholt, who were related to my father. In fact, the Overholts had a Wagler as a mother. Hannah Overholt was a Wagler. She was my grandfather's sister. The Overholts were strange characters. They did not get married until very late in life. One never got married, but the other married late in life. Very interesting progressive thinkers. But when I was 8 years old, they visited my home, which was just 2 miles north of here, the old home place. And I remember Joe Overholt talking to me. I was just a little tyke. Talking to me about a country that he had visited. And there was a huge square in front of a Kremlin. And he said, in this country, they teach atheism. Religion is not permitted in this country. And on top of the towers of the Kremlin, there are red stars. And he told me about communism, how it persecutes Christians and other religions, and how he was standing there on this brick-covered red square, and he prayed that God would somehow save the people of this country. I was 8 years old, but I remember that. That country was Russia. It was the Soviet Union back then. But that piqued my interest. And then later that year, we had a visitor in the Old Order Amish church by the name of Peter Denica, who was the founder of Slavic Gospel Association. He stayed at our place Saturday evening, and on Sunday morning we went to church with Peter Denica in the buggy. And I still remember distinctly what we talked about. He, of course, was an immigrant from the Soviet Union. Devout Christian. He was known as Peter Dynamite. Denica was his name. He was actually white Russian, but that was not significant. He was, for all practical purposes, Russian. He spoke Russian. And I remember after church people asking him about what life was like in this atheist country, the Soviet Union. And he went back home with us after church, and I still remember the conversations we had. It had rained that day, and I can still see the buggy wheels cutting into the gravel road as we went home. And Peter Denica also inspired me to think about Russia, and later, as fate would have it, or you can call it something else, I worked for a Slavic Gospel Association. I did not work for them, but they frequently asked me to speak at their meetings. And I got to know Peter Denica quite well, not as well as his son, who became the new director of Slavic Gospel Association. And so I worked for many years with Slavic Gospel Association. So those were two youthful impulses that got me interested in the Soviet Union and Russia, but probably the most significant was when I was 14 years old. I did not go to Hutchinson much. I went to Hutchinson maybe once every 2 months. It was a big event to go to Hutchinson. When I did, I always went to the public library. And it's interesting because the people in the public library recognized me. They knew who I was. And they would set aside books for me to read. They said, "This is what you should read." I still remember those older ladies. How they remembered me, I don't know. Well, probably because of my distinctive dress. But when I was 14, they gave me the book, The Brothers Karamazov. And they told me I should read that book and Crime and Punishment. So, I brought Crime and Punishment home in July when I was 14 years old. And I was fascinated by that book. It is a detective story. It's a criminal story. It's about the murder of several old women by a young man, a student, who needed money. He was poor, and he murdered an old pawnbroker who he thought had a lot of money hidden away somewhere under the pillows or under a mattress somewhere. So he sneaked into her apartment and killed her. And then her daughter happened to show up, so he had to kill her too, to kill the witness to the murder. But this is one of the most incredible novels ever written. It is a novel not about murder, but it's about how one justifies murder, how one justifies killing an innocent person, because you are young, you have your whole life ahead of you, you are going to change the world. You are going to be Napoleon. You are going to do so much for the world. And this old lady is worthless. She's not doing any good. The psychology of that novel is absolutely incredible. So I read that when I was 14, and I had it out in the wheat field, which is just 2 miles north of here. And my uncle Willie Wagler, you probably don't remember him, but he was a very distinguished minister in the Beachy Amish Church. Well, at that time it was Old Order Amish. And he came over because Willie and my father farmed together. So everything that we did together. And Willie came over and saw me sitting in the wheat stubble there in the shade reading this book called Crime and Punishment. And Willie told me in his best ministerial tone, and he was a minister, he was accustomed to telling people what they should and what they should not do. So he told me, Harley, voor was kannst du net etwas Gescheites lesen? Harley, why can't you read something worthwhile? Because I was filling my 14-year-old mind with crime and punishment, murder, justification for murder, violence, using an axe to kill someone. Little did he realize that this little Amish boy would become a leading scholar of Dostoevsky. I am today a published, acknowledged expert on Dostoevsky. So Willie, if you turn over in your grave, that is okay, because I regard Dostoevsky as one of the great Christian writers of all time. I teach him. I taught him last semester to Russian students. And I emphasize his Christianity. I emphasize his philosophy. I emphasize his art, psychology. But Dostoevsky was really my inspiration for studying Russia. I was moved by people who talked about persecution of Christians in Russia, but the greatest single influence was Fyodor Dostoevsky. And today I read and reread his works. I read the critics. Today, my goddaughter, who lives in Russia, is reading his greatest novel, The Brothers Karamazov, and she loves Dostoevsky, partly through my influence. So it was both the cultural aspects of Russia and the influence of the Soviet government and their persecution of Christians that attracted me, and that is why I have devoted my adult life to working in Slavic countries, and specifically in Russia, although I also spent time in Yugoslavia and Bulgaria. I know the South Slavic languages as well as the Eastern Slavic ones. That's what got me interested. It's a long answer, but that's what it is.
Adjust this thing a little bit. Okay. Next one is we'll talk about Russian Mennonites and their relation to Kansas.
Russian Mennonites have a strong connection to Kansas because in the 1870s and 80s, there was a revival movement among the Russian Mennonites. The Russian Mennonites were by definition German. When they were invited to Russia by Catherine the Great, who herself was German, they made an agreement that they would not proselytize among the Slavic peoples. So their church services were in German. They spoke German in their homes, in their communities. They were given land and they formed towns that were Mennonite towns. Mennonite farms surrounded these towns. It was, in effect, an isolated Mennonite German community. Over time, these Mennonites became very wealthy. They moved further to the east. They were originally invited only to South Ukraine, Crimea, and Molochna and Zaporozhye in southern Ukraine. But eventually they moved east to Siberia, to Kazakhstan, to the Volga region up north where I live. I live on the Volga River. But wherever they went, they maintained that German identity. The Volga Germans became famous for their fruit orchards. They were tremendous farmers. They were hardworking. They were frugal. They had that German pedantry. They worked hard. And they tended to view the Slavs with contempt. They were better than the Slavs. This was a common theme among these Mennonite groups. But in the 1870s then, there was a revival movement, and some of the younger Mennonites became known as Stundists. That is, after the regular church service on Sunday, and after the common meal, they had an hour of Bible study. Stund, the German word for an hour is Stund. So they became known as Stundists. They spent an hour studying the Bible after the regular church service. And then they said, we need to evangelize the Slavic people, these Russians, these Ukrainians. They drink a lot. They do not live Christian lives. We need to evangelize them. But the elders said, no, you can't do that because we signed an agreement with the government that we would not evangelize. So these young Stundists said, well, we reject these restrictions by the church. We have a higher calling. We will go out and evangelize among the Slavs. And these Stundists became the Baptists then. If you married a Slav, or if you left the Mennonite church and wanted to be more evangelistic, you became Baptist. That was the beginning of the Baptist movement. Well, it also created a split in the Mennonites. And so one part of that Mennonite movement then immigrated to America. A large part of that immigration moved to Canada, Western Canada, Alberta, Manitoba, and there are still many Russian Mennonites there. But a significant portion of them also moved to Kansas. They were looking for areas that were similar to the topography of Ukraine and southern Russia. Land that was flat, land that could be farmed easily. Western Canada and Kansas had that. Climate was similar. They brought with them turkey red wheat, which is a very famous part of the folklore of Russian Mennonites. Sunflowers they brought, and they brought certain foods like zvibak and piraki, foods that were common among the Slavs as well as among the Mennonites. So the Mennonites then came to Kansas in the first wave, but then there were other waves that followed. Like after World War II, there was a large immigration because of the persecution by the communists. And the Mennonites that moved to Kansas founded Bethel College then and Tabor College. But this was part of that split that had occurred back in the 1870s. You could not have the Mennonite Brethren living alongside the General Conference Mennonites. There were two different groups. So the Mennonite Brethren founded Tabor College in Hillsboro, and the General Conference Mennonites founded Bethel College in Newton, just a few miles apart. But, you know, water and oil do not mix. They had to have two different schools. But the Mennonites in this area around Newton and Hillsboro were basically Russian Mennonites. Ukrainian Mennonites would be a more correct term, but back then we called the Soviet Union Russia too. Everything there was Russian. Now there's much more that could be said about that history, but that is the origin of the movement. They brought with them their German culture and the practices that they had learned in southern Russia. The way they built their buildings, how they organized their farms, how they organized their villages, how they did church. The Mennonite Brethren in Hillsboro do it differently than the General Conference in Newton. They brought that culture with them. And the Mennonite Brethren are much more closely associated with the Stundists, with the Baptists. Many of the Stundists were Mennonite Brethren. Fewer were from the so-called church Mennonite, or what we say in contemporary terms, General Conference Mennonites, although as you know that no longer exists. It's now MCUSA, which is one organization. But historically it's the General Conference and the Mennonite Brethren. Now the Amish communities here in Reno County have nothing to do with the Mennonites in Newton or Hillsboro. Their roots are totally different. They do not have that Russian or Ukrainian background. The Amish have Swiss and German, French background. So much more could be said about the history, but that's a brief overview of how the Mennonites ended up in Kansas.
How have you noticed Kansas changing each time you come home? Or have you noticed changing?
Yes, I do. Well, first of all, one of the main reasons I come back to Kansas is because of my community. This is where I grew up. This is the church I grew up in. This is the community, the Partridge community, which I love very much. And so the changes that I notice are related to this particular subculture, this community. I follow politics a little bit too, but that's another question. So what do I notice in the community here when I come back? I have studied a little bit about the history of this community. I know when the first Amish moved into this community in 1882. The first Amish settlers moved here east of Partridge, Noah Yoder and Chris Bontrager. And they were part of this immigration from the east, the railroads who controlled this community. They were given title to every other section of land. 5 miles on either side of the railroad was owned by the railroad. They had every alternate section. And so it was in their interest to lure people to come to this area and buy this land. It was good for the railroad, their business, and it was good for the local economy, and it was good for Kansas. And so Noah Yoder and Chris Bontrager were the first 2 Amish families to come to Partridge via the railroad. There was already an Amish community in Yoder that had been established several years earlier. But the Yoders and the Bontraegers, when they first came, they built sod houses. Bontrager lived up here where the Amish cemetery is, right there by the 50 highway, if you know where that is. They had both built sod houses first. That was the first year they were here. And what is interesting, the surveyors from the railroad often stayed at their house. They were surveying these sections. You know, this is money. And up to 10 people per night would stay at the Yoders and the Bontraegers. And they had a little sod house. There was not much room. So you can imagine what these English surveyors did, living in this Amish house, staying there overnight. And it worked out well because they were paid a little bit for this. And so the Amish then were brought here by the railroad, and once Noah and the Bontraegers were here, they invited their relatives. In fact, if you go to the Amish and most of the Mennonite churches here, you will find descendants of Noah Yoder and Chris Bontrager in every one of the congregations. These old families that first came. Well, and also it is very important to remember that my grandfather, Peter Wagler, moved here from western Kansas in 1920. He moved here because he liked the Amish community. He liked Jacob Miller, who was the bishop. He said he is a spiritual man. Did not want to move back to Indiana, where his other relatives lived. And then in the 1880s also, Daniel Mast, who is my great-grandfather. I never met him. He died before I was born, but he is a very important part of my heritage. So Daniel Mast and Peter Wagler, my ancestors, both helped form this community of which I am a part. And so I grew up in the Amish community, and many of my values were shaped by that experience. Although I have moved far away from that, I read novels, which you're not supposed to do. My Uncle Willie said you should not read novels. They fill your mind with lies and evil thoughts. And now I teach literature. So when I come back, what are some of the main changes that I see? Well, I see increasing economic prosperity. People are wealthy. Everyone has work. Everyone has money. Everyone has a car. In Russia, you do not have cars. I never have a car. I do not drive for 10 months out of the year. And everyone here has a car. Everyone is relatively wealthy. I mean, I look at this from the perspective of living abroad. This is a wealthy community. People have money. People have big houses. I built this house for my mother. I think it is an obscenity, but I did it for my mother, and she lived here for the last years of her life, and she died here. And that is why I built the house. So we are wealthy. We are hardworking. This is a community where people trust each other and really support each other. As I watch the evolution of the churches, I also think the values of Daniel Mast and Peter Wagler are still in evidence, because for the most part, the churches here have very cordial relationships. There is very little tension. There is no overt animosity among the different churches. I consider that a great plus. This is how the church should live. I am very much a church-oriented person and believe that our lives should be oriented around the church. We should not be individualistic, we should be community-oriented. Having said that, I do see some negative changes. I see more atomization in this community. That is, if you understand the term, what I mean by that is, if I disagree with someone in matters of church, I will simply go off and start my own church. That is what I call atomization. I am more important than the overall church community. I can do whatever I bloody well please because I am now the leader of this small church. And you see that happening more and more. In my experience in Russia, I do not see that as much. I am much more, I'm a traditionalist in that I value the traditions. I am an elder in a Baptist church there, but I tell them, you tell me what to do. I'm not going to be dictating to you how you should behave. And that is also my policy in the university, although I teach whatever I want, and they encourage me to teach my religious values. In fact, that's why they assign me the works they do. But I will not undermine the values that the university has or the church has. So I would say there is some atomization and there is increasing materialism. People are too wrapped up in making money, and it hurts family values. Parents spend so much time making money, they don't have time to spend with their children, which I think is very important. So I also think there is perhaps a sclerosis of the arteries, a hardening of the arteries here in terms of some churches becoming a little less tolerant of others, that I am right and you are wrong. Everyone has a right to do that, but I would say in church matters we need to be very careful not to judge others. Be careful to respect others and listen to them. I am more a conciliator than a confrontationalist in church matters. So these differences are related to the church. I don't know, in a larger sense, I think politically, Kansans tend to be very predictable. William Allen White, one of the most famous Kansans of all time, the editor of the Emporia Gazette, said that Kansans tend to be Puritan at heart. They are ideologically Puritans. That is, you tend to be very firm in what you believe, and you're willing to stand up and die for that belief. Which is probably true, but in America of 2016, we realize that we need to be more flexible and understanding of other points of view. But in short, I always enjoy coming back here. That nature doesn't change a lot. I love nature. I love the open sky at night. I often go out and just look at the stars. I notice what is growing along the roads. I love animals. I love wildflowers. I love the open fields. I love sunsets. I love fields of sunflowers, which were brought here from Russia. Sunsets here are incredible. That doesn't change. So I don't know if you have a follow-up question you can ask.
Kind of answer the next one. What remains constant? What do you look forward to the most coming here each summer?
Well, I enjoy visiting my family. I always came here to stay with Mom. I love the church and the extended family, seeing relatives, working with my sister on the garden. I go to the market every Saturday. I just love seeing people. And I also went to Partridge Elementary School. I did not go to an Amish school. So in my formative years, for 8 years, I spent all of my life with English kids, so-called English kids, kids that weren't Amish. And I meet with them every summer. In fact, we have an agreement that I must look them up. People from Wichita, from Haven, from Partridge, from Hutchinson. I love these folks. They shaped me for 8 years, and every 5 years we have a reunion, and we had one 2 years ago, and everyone agreed it was the best reunion we'd ever had. Older, some of the people in my class have died, but they always say that I must come to these meetings because I live abroad, and most of them also say that I am the one who should have gone to high school. I didn't go to high school with them, so technically it's a high school reunion, but they include me because we were in elementary school together. I love seeing those folks. And not least of all, I love nature here. I love the hot weather. I love animals. I'm quite a photographer. And I really love nature. In fact, yesterday, I went down to my favorite bat site. I have secret sites around here. I have a nest of barn owls. I call them my barn owls because for the last 5 years, I have gone there to see this nest of barn owls. And I have this one place where there are literally hundreds of bats in an enclosed area. And last summer I found a rat snake living with those bats. And I photographed it. It's a huge rat snake. It's probably 3 meters long, 8-9 feet long, fat. Every morning it has a bat for breakfast. And last summer I got a picture of it. I was there when it caught that. And it's a constrictor. And it allowed me to take a picture because it was so preoccupied. I probably got 70 pictures of it in this lengthy process of suffocating the bat and then working it around so it could get it into its mouth. And this is not a black rat snake. It's very attractive. It's red and yellow. Pockmarked rat snake, very beautiful creature. Well, yesterday I saw, it's back there again. It goes back behind the boards, but it's in there. And just this morning, I took a beautiful picture of a great horned owl. Beautiful, I could show it to you. And I'm looking for kangaroo rat now. I have several people who said they will capture a kangaroo rat for me so I can photograph it. So I love to take pictures of wildlife. And in Russia, I teach at the university, but I have helped people understand that there are beautiful birds and animals living in my city that they did not realize were there. And my love for wildlife comes from here. I learned that as a child. So that's one of my titles, is the guy who loves wild animals and birds.
What has Kansas taught you that you apply to your life in Russia?
Okay. Kansas has taught me the importance of tolerance. I grew up in a very small subculture, but I went to school with English kids. I loved those 8 years of school. And the English kids were different than I was, but we loved each other. And we talked about that at our last reunion. Said, Harley, you were different, but you were the person we all looked up to. And we did. I loved school. I loved the teachers. I loved the others. And it made me understand that while I am different, we can trust and love each other nonetheless. And Kay Stiggins, she made life miserable for me in the 8th grade because she was always flirting. In the Amish culture, you're not supposed to flirt, but she did. She would wink at me and call me honey and all these different names, and I would just lose my mind, and it was fun torture for her. But you know what? She married 3 times. She was the cutest little girl in class. The guys were crazy over her. And she married 3 times and had 3 miserable marriages. She talks about that. She says, I just never had good luck with marriage. And that's why she is probably my closest friend from the class. She insists that I come down and visit her every summer. So, tolerance, understanding and respecting other people for who they are. Hard work. I learned to work as a child. I always had chores to do. And as a teacher and as a researcher, I understand the importance of doing precise work and working hard. Learning languages is not easy. I know a few languages. And in my classes, one thing I tell the students is I do not pardon laziness. You work. If you work, I will acknowledge your efforts. People have different levels of ability, but if you are in university in Russia, you are a good student. You do not go to university just because you're 18. It's because you are qualifying. So my Russian students are academically at a much higher level than their American counterparts. In fact, my goddaughter, who is now in the university, in her elementary school class, there were 40 pupils. Only 4 of them go to university. 1 out of 10 goes to university. So I learned the importance of hard work. I learned the importance of honesty and integrity, which is part, I would say, of the Anabaptist tradition. What you believe should not differ markedly from how you behave. Your behavior should mirror what you believe. And I am a very, very firm believer in knowing what you believe. We must know our beliefs, but we must also be disciplined. We must be discipled. And the importance of other people telling you when you need discipline. You need to be humble enough to accept discipline. That's what church is about. That's what community is about. And I would also say the importance of community, but that's not something I had to learn in Russia. The Russians are very community-oriented. They are much less individualistic than we are. So in some ways, I'm very much at home in a Slavic environment. And I suppose there are other things too that I've learned. But the importance of open spaces and reaching out. You know, my father and my uncle, Willie Wagler, they made a trip which was supposed to be around the world in the 1930s. The importance of reaching out, expanding, not being insular. And so I suppose I have a little of my father's adventurous spirit, and also Daniel Mast, my great-grandfather. And Peter Wagler, my grandfather on my father's side. They were all pioneers in their own way. So don't be afraid to branch out, but never ever overlook the value of tradition and the stability and the solidity that tradition brings. I, in fact, believe that if you have a good self-identity, you belong to a community and know where you stand, you are perfectly willing to venture out, do new things, and not make a fool of yourself. You can respect other people for their views. You don't feel threatened. And, I have had many experiences in Russia where they have tried to intimidate me, and it doesn't bother me at all. And they tend to respect that too.
Last one is, what does it mean to be a Kansan?
What does it mean to be a Kansan? Well, as I said before, when the Russian people, my friends, tell me that I'm going back to America, they do not say you're going back to America. They say you're going back to Kansas, because that's part of my identity. And the people who know me well know a lot about Kansas. I talk about the values. I just got an email yesterday telling me, how are things in Kansas? Not how are things in America, how are things in Kansas? I appreciate the history of Kansas. I appreciate the fact that this was a state that chose, during the Civil War, they chose to stay with the North rather than the South. As you know, it was a border state, and there was a lot of controversy about bleeding Kansas. But Kansans stuck with their values. Kansas also stuck for many years with the dry position, the prohibition against alcohol. You can take different views on the use of alcohol, but Kansas, in fact, Partridge, the town of Partridge, for many years prided itself on never serving liquor, when Hutchinson and the other towns about did. So a certain pride in identity, the values of good Kansas people, hard work, frugality, generosity, openness, open spaces. We never locked the doors of this house. It has locks, but I don't know where the keys are. It's never been locked since it was built. A sense of purpose, that we know where we're going. We want to save nature. We want to save the Ogallala Aquifer. Steps are being taken to do that. Farmers work hard and they want to make money, but there is an increasing sense that we also need to be good stewards of the land. Let us save the water. I am a strong proponent of putting limitations on the amount of irrigation you can do. This strong religious tradition here, the tradition of acceptance of new practices. We have Siemens out here, which is cutting edge technology for new forms of energy. And I like the church. I like the religious traditions that are here. A lot of good things are happening in the churches here in the community. Politically, I am a little bit concerned about some things. I think we need to be perhaps a bit more open to other ways of thinking. Brownback, of course, emphasizes cutting taxes. I have no problem with paying taxes. I pay a lot of taxes on this house. I say, fine. I want there to be roads and bridges and schools and hospitals. I have no problem with paying taxes. But I realize that too is a political position that is open to question. And there are some good businesses here. And some local businesses that are really doing good work, giving people jobs. And Partridge has now expanded through Pleasant View, through Sturdy Build all the way out to Hutchinson. There's a route of good, strong business people that have helped this community flourish. I'm very honored that we have people in Kansas history who have brought honor to the name of Kansas, like William Allen White, William Inge, the dramatist, the playwright, who wrote some very, very good plays, William Stafford, the poet from Hutchinson, probably the best poet to come out of Kansas. He has done this state a great honor by being from Hutchinson. And then Dwight Eisenhower, who was not born here, but he's considered a Kansan, was a good president. I think history has shown him to have behaved very responsibly, very cautiously, and he predicted some things that have come to happen. I think Ike was a good president. And then, of course, we have Kansas basketball. You know, people at the university know that I like Kansas basketball. Bill Self, who I do not like, but he is a good coach. A good coach. And so Kansas basketball is what really brings pride to the state, but we also have Wichita State now coming in. And by the way, Bill Self is the most important personality in the state of Kansas. Did you know that? The governor, the senators, congressmen, big businessmen, the Koch brothers, they're nothing. Bill Self is the most powerful Kansan right now.
That's all I have. Do you have anything else you want to talk about, or?
No, I do enjoy this local region. See, I went to school with descendants of the first settlers in this region. Like there's a guy named Zeno Tharp, who was down on Riverton Road at the Nimiscar River, the first white settler in Troy Township. And he said one time, he moved here in 1872, before there was any Reno Center or Partridge or anyone else. And he said one day he was out on the Nimiscar River. He lived down there, built a house there, log house. And there was a herd of bison, buffalo, we call them, that crossed the Nimiscar River. This was 1872, not that long ago. And he said when they left the Nimiscar River, they were moving north. The river was dry. They drank the river dry. There were so many of them, apparently thousands and thousands of them. They drank all the water out of the Nimiscar. That was 1872. Partridge was founded in, just about 10 years later. But I went to school with some of these first early settlers, the Frenches. I went to school with them. The Hamiltons, the Dellenbachs, and the Dillies. I didn't go to school with the Dillies, but the Gormleys. So local history, I find it fascinating and interesting, and it helps ground you in Kansas if you know something about the history and can connect personally with that history. And the Tom Krotz, and I went to school with Melinda Krotz, who was a descendant of Tom Krotz. He was the first blacksmith. He lived a mile west of Partridge before there was a town of Partridge. But he opened a blacksmith's shop. And that was very important because the people who came through in covered wagons often needed to have work done, either on horseshoes or something needed to be fixed in the wagon. And Tom Krotz was a famous blacksmith. He received a certain amount of notoriety because the word spread that there's a guy out here west of Hutchinson, about 12 miles, who is a good blacksmith. And he had a long career then as the Partridge blacksmith when Partridge eventually opened. And I went to school with Melinda Krotz, who would be his great-great-granddaughter.
Can't really think of any other questions I should ask. Now I have to go build a movie out of it.
Well, you can edit quite easily, I'm
Yeah.
sure.
Hopefully.
Yeah, I just got an email last night from my goddaughter.